It's a new year, it's a new patch, it's a new game. 14.1 has now fundamentally changed a lot of TFT with economy and a bunch of buffs. The graphic alone for all the changes this patch is crazy. But worry not, I got the best comps that are crushing the first week of the patch so that you can climb infinite LP. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to my sponsor, Mobalytics, who is helping bring you guys this video. Mobalytics is a dedicated data website to help you find the analysis and edge you need to climb. Check out their stuff at mobalytics.gg/TFT, where you can find compositions by myself, Dissoap, and many other top players in North America. By downloading their overlay, you can get meta comps in-game, as well as look at different community comps and my own compositions I'm using to climb. It's also the overlay that I use that recommends me real-time data of augments, as well as other information happening in the lobby, so that I can stay up to date. Download the app so you can get your best set 9.5 comps in-game with the Mobalytics overlay. Twin Terror Executioner is the most OP comp in the game. It is so powerful, but it is balanced or held back by the fact that you need to hit the augment and you need to hit the comp. Twin Terror 1 and 2 are both very good, and remember that you really want to prioritize your backline. You don't really care that much about having like two Pantheons because they don't really benefit from the attack speed and the critical strike chance. They get extra HP. So something that is nice to have, but not really important. You really want to level 7 reroll, but a lot of times people also roll on 6. There's actually two ways to play this. One, you can play around Twitch as your main carry because you have a bunch of AD items. And that's actually the way that you often play because just the tempo of the lobby doesn't let you get to 7 and play around Vex very easily. And so a lot of times the way you actually approach this build is you actually lose streak early. You're not really supposed to play many units. You usually hold on to like 1 or 2 Twitches and then maybe like a Pantheon. And then maybe you get your discounted punk rerolls, maybe you don't. But the whole point is get to 3-2 with as much gold as possible, level to 6, and then roll on 6 until you hit Twitch, Pantheon, Vex, and Mumu, or some variation of that where you're getting Twin Terror value. Executioner Twitch is the best, but I mean, it's just so busted. You could really use whatever version you want, like punk. If you do end up hitting Vex as your headliner, you do end up picking it up, but you have to make sure you have items for her. Otherwise, you're playing like Twitch 1, and then like Vex 2, and then a Mumu Pantheon. It's like, it's kind of awkward. And that is why people end up preferring Twitch as their headliner, because it just makes a smoother game plan as opposed to, you know, playing for the end game immediately. But make no mistake, the highest cap of this composition, if you could teleport and snap your fingers, is Vex headliner with Vex 3, Twitch 3, Amumu 3. Amumu does get the tank items as well. Pantheon falls off the face of the planet, and 2 Amumus is really good in order to just, you know, stall out long enough, especially if you can get the 3-star. Amumu scales better off of things like Warmogs and Steadfast Heart than Bramble Declaw, but sometimes you just have to take whatever you can get. This is because Guardians really scale off of the HP, and the damage reduction is really good with their shield. You don't really need resistances on Amumu. If you look at something like JG and I a little bit closer, if you are able to crit already, it gives you extra bonus damage instead. And that bonus damage is really huge because you can scale your damage and go for these massive crits, and all of a sudden Twitch and Vex are going to be destroying everything. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just watch this YouTube video that I made of exactly this build about a week ago that ended up becoming one of the best comps in the game. I talk about positioning and how people like play into it and just generally show you what's really OP about it. I do think that it's also worth taking some of these other augments if you get a chance to, like Emotional Connection, which is good with the emo, and Exposed Weakness, which is really strong with the Executioners for itemization. You don't need Last Whisper or Spark or anything like that anymore. Also, the guide here shows you that you can also take a Mumu as your headliner, which is true because a Mumu headliner is very good to be able to make him tankier. But I will also emphasize that a lot of times, as long as you have like your bases covered, which is anti-heal, armor reduction, and, you know, all this extra base damage, you can pretty much itemize a bunch of different ways. I've seen people do really scuffed builds with this composition because they aren't able to get the ideal items. Do not try to greed for best in slot everything. Sometimes I've seen people go like adaptive Nashers, like Giant Slayer Vex, which just sounds like bad, but it worked because it's Vex 3. And they have like Ruined, Red Buff, and like Deathblade, like just things that just don't look like this, but they still popped off anyways because it's just so much extra damage that they get. Oh, also shout out to Lucky Gloves because they give you the really good items. And I think that's actually really emblematic of how item agnostic this comp can actually be, because you just get the Lucky Gloves and you get those base crit and you get that extra HP bonus, which is really nice. Pentakill, Karthus, Akali. This is a comp that is probably not only really powerful, but one of the most frustrating to play against, because in tandem, Karthus targets the weakest units and Akali jumps to the backline. So they often 1-2 punch and assassinate a lot of backline carries. And so if you're really frustrated by things like Twisted Fate or the Ezreal Caitlyn's or just anybody else that's hanging out in the back, Karthus Akali is a really powerful punishment composition that is really good at destroying not just those backline carries, but also people who are low rolling. The general approach is that you're going for a fast 8 where you roll for a 4-cost headliner. Either Karthus or Akali is totally fine, and you're pretty much okay with taking any variation of them. The best, I think, is probably Pentakill Karthus, because that lets you get to 7 Pentakill much easier, and you don't necessarily need something like a Pentakill emblem, or else you're going to play some low quality use like Olaf in the late game. The other thing to think about is whether or not you can get a Pentakill emblem onto Akali as well, because she really benefits from that bonus damage as well as that damage reduction onto every Pentakill unit. The thing about the way you play this is that a lot of times you're not really focusing on making Akali items. She's so versatile and can utilize all different kinds of stats that you're actually better off trying to prioritize Karthus items at the very start. So he really cares about things like mana because he needs to cast before you can stack on things like AP. And now that Death Cap has been buffed to give 20 bonus percentage damage, and that's to any type of damage, but mainly AP champions, you can definitely prioritize that, or you can go for Archangels. You can also play like Adaptive instead of Spirit of Shojin. You can also put like other bonus damage sources, like if you don't have Guard Break, you can put like Giant Slayer. There's a lot of different things that you can do. One thing to note, by the way, is Karthus's auto attack is what triggers Executioner on that trait effect, where Executioner is dealing bonus damage to people that are below a certain HP threshold. If Karthus is targeting something with his auto attack, that actually does that bonus damage, and it factors into Karthus' ability. And so you want Karthus to target some weak things in the late game, like a Tentacle, for example, from Malawi. Speaking of which, if you do want to counter this comp, you probably place things like Alawi. If you're wondering like why Karthus is so much stronger now, is because they buffed his damage, they buffed his traits, and now he also bug fixed him, so he's not targeting things like Zed clones, which was a hilarious but stupid interaction. So now with all those things combined, not to mention other things getting nerfed and some pretty good matchups in the meta, Karthus Akali once again is back to deleting a bunch of backlines. The recommended way to play around it is through Superfan, because Superfan with Nico, Lilia, and Gnar give you a really strong early game because you can play around KDA. So let's say you play like Nico, Lilia, Gnar, and then you have like a Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa can hold something like Shojin Guardbreaker or Shojin, you know, Hodge, red buff, things like that. And then you're able to like stack up the Pentakill slowly. You're not trying to rush the Pentakill because remember, it's weak early game. And then eventually you go for that big level 8 roll down at 4-2 and try to stabilize. You might be wondering if you ever buy Viego, and the answer is you can. It actually bridges out to a different type of Pentakill composition where you're playing around like Viego and Karthus and less around Akali. But that's what gives this tree a lot of flexibility. You actually have multiple ways that you can play it, because if you do play around Viego, for example, you're going to try to get edgelords in. And so you want to play Kayle, and that kind of like branches out into like maybe a Kayn setup, and then you have Karthus Kayn plus Viego. So there's a lot of different things you can do with Pentakill, which is what makes it so versatile and probably like at the top of S tier. The early game plan recommendation also suggests Olaf as a really good item holder, and that's great because he doesn't really make a lot of late game composition boards, and so he can also hold a lot of really good items, either your front items for like your Mordekaiser, for example. And this Mordekaiser, we just suggested Bloodthirster Titans because he's good with it, but you can also do like Warmogs and Steadfast Heart, totally fine. And then you can also just like play around the Superfan flex, like for example, you hit this level 6 board where you go for, you know, KDA with the Seraphine, and then you hit like a Mordekaiser and the Gnar, and who knows, maybe hit Pentakill, and then you get the ability to play around 3 Pentakill in the mid game. Another thing to consider is that Mordekaiser 3 is also an out you could play for, but not very common because of how popular this trait is, and also because you're off better spending your gold sometimes and trying to find something like Akali 2 and Karthus 2 instead. Some augments to really think about is Metalheads, which just gives your Pentakill champions effectively a Quicksilver, which is pretty ridiculous. Also, you benefit a lot from just having combat augments because of how it synergizes with the Pentakill trait, just a lot of amplification through damage. And things like Harmestis is also really good too. I will say one thing is that item-based augments can also be somewhat reliable because you often don't really have enough items for Karthus, Akali, and a tank, and then maybe you also suffer Viego until late in the game. And so it's okay also to take something like, you know, Buried Treasures or like, you know, Idealism, whatever, like any kind of like item augments that make sense to get snowballing your tempo, and also you can itemize multiple carries. Disco is back to being at the very top of S tier as well, and part of the reason why Twisted Fate is really good is that Disco got so many buffs. And it's not the amount of buffs, but if you just keep doing enough to kind of push it into a direction, it will definitely be really good. And also it's really consistent and easy to play. It's one of the easiest comps because it's just fairly linear in terms of how you're actually trying to build momentum into a Disco board. They did end up taking away a little bit of damage. Like they reverted the TF damage buff as well as nerf Dazzler a little bit. bit, but that shouldn't scare you away from trying to play this composition because it caps really high, and it also has a really good chance of winning the game if you're able to get to like these 5 costs like Alawi, Sona, and Ziggs. Ziggs is really good for the Dazzler effect with Twisted Fate, and also sometimes gets you the ability to shred if you're lacking it. If you don't have Ziggs, you definitely need shred. You're just not going to be able to get through any front line, and you really need to try to burst through if you can. If you don't have that shred, you're going to struggle a lot. And then Sona is really powerful with Rage Blade. A lot of people are playing AP variants of Sona now and not necessarily focusing on trying to go for the attack speed. But I'm not entirely sure if that means you're always playing AP in this variation, but give it a try and let me see which is better, attack speed or AP. I think AP is probably better at the moment. The real big thing is that if you can hit Alawi early, you stabilize your front line a lot because it gives you so much stall in front line. And that just means that the longer you stall, the more you're stacking the attack speed, so Disco continues to ramp. The real key of what makes Twisted Fate and Disco particularly powerful also is that it shares a lot of itemization with Akali. You can go for like Shojin, Red Buff, and Death Cap, and that also are items you can put on Karthus and Akali because Akali can take the Red Buff and then Shojin AP can be onto the Karthus, for example. But then you also have the flexibility of just kind of going into whatever itemizations you can get. So if you get like a Nashor's Tooth and you get Archangels and you have Morello, those are also great items on Twisted Fate. And not to mention that you have even more flexibility with like turning him into a heal bot, which is, you know, having a Gunblade so you can stall out and heal your Giga Tank Blitzcrank and then just kind of go from there. So the TLDR is that TF can probably use like 8 to 9 items pretty equally. In fact, if you look at the data, it suggests that Twisted Fate is actually pretty close in terms of like a bunch of items like that you can justify, which is like within like 2/10 of a delta. And that's just nerd speak for saying that like mathematically speaking, this Twisted Fate could just probably use all different kinds of items. What really matters more than anything is how you fast 8 and rolling your gold and not over rolling, because you want to stop rolling at 8 to get to 9. So when you get to 9, you can get all those extra 5 costs like Alawi, Sona, Ziggs, and then you also can probably add in like stuff like 4 Dazzler. The early game is fairly straightforward where you try to play around Disco, Nami, and Taric, and a lot of times you can even play around some of these like Spellweavers, like Annie, for example, is a really good item holder for Disco. Don't forget your front line though. A lot of times people feel like they throw items onto Taric and they just leave it as B, but you want another Guardian. So, you know, in this case, we recommended like Pantheon, but it could be anything. And then as you're getting to 7, one unit that I do want to highlight is Lulu. And this is an alternative champion that we suggested here in our guide. And Lulu is a particularly strong champion right now because she is versatile with her item holding because she's low mana. And she's actually very strong at team utility, kind of like Ziggs. And then she also deals a pretty good amount of damage. There's actually situations where you could probably even use Lulu as a secondary carry alongside Twisted Fate if you're stuck on 8, but that usually means that you're in a bad scenario, so you're trying to avoid that. Augments that you're thinking about are things like Double the Funk, like, you know, that's a really powerful disco based augment, but also something that amplifies all that AP damage. Dual Lotus crits are really good. Ascension and things that give you bonus damage is also good. And don't forget about Keepers. Keepers is something that goes well with Disco as well, because the Disco Ball counts as a unit that's adjacent to your allies, so you actually get that extra shield, which can be good for that stall and that ramp. Positioning is fairly straightforward in that you usually have your disco balls, like 2 of them, and your frontliners in front of 1 of them, and your backlines in front of others. The real nuance of disco, though, if you're like a Masters, Grandmasters player trying to like get the Challenger, is knowing when to peel off a vertical disco. Anybody knows how to play like a 5 or 6 disco setup and position around it, but when you're not hitting and it's optimal to actually play like 3 to 4 disco and you only have 1 disco ball, you have to probably weigh the risk and reward of greeding and trying to have like a full clump here and having 1 unit in the solo front line, or just kind of stacking it entirely on your front line to make sure that you have good positioning. And to do that with factoring things like Akali or someone's playing Lux, like different ways they can assassinate the corner, which is why it's kind of important to spread out. So Disco is a simple comp to learn, but you actually have a lot of small things you can do to optimize at the very top end. So it's deceptively difficult at the very high levels. One mistake that I made is to rely on Sentinel Blitzcrank. I think that is significantly worse than the other options. You want Disco or Dazzler by like a mile. I'm pretty sure the best variant is Dazzler Twisted Fate, but you know, sometimes you just go for Disco instead. So if you do have Sentinel Blitzcrank, I ended up staying on it one time, and I think I just like lost like a lot of power, and I wish I could have that back. I should have just sold it when I had a chance to roll down again and then go for either a Twisted Fate or a better headliner in general. In terms of reroll comps, Riven might be just as strong as Yone. A lot of people argue whether or not 6-8-bit Riven caps higher than Yone, but it kind of depends. Both require like a lot of conditions to be really good. The general game plan is pretty straightforward. You want to get to level 7 and stay on 7 until you hit Riven 3. But once you hit Riven 3, you can go to level 8, find things like Kayn, and try to hit like Viego 2, Caitlyn 2, if you haven't hit them already. The thing about Riven compared to Yone is that she's much more specific with what items she wants. She really wants a strong AD item that really amplifies her damage. So in this case, we have Giant Slayer because I think it's one of her best ways of converting off of the 8-bit AD. But you can also have like Infinity Edge. You can also go like Titans if you want on Riven, but I don't really think that's as strong. And you want healing, so you can go for like Bloodthirster or Hand of Justice. And Quicksilver is the most important item on Riven because she's so auto-focused that if she gets interrupted even at all, she ends up losing a significant amount of her DPS. So Riven is very strong right now, even at 2-star, and can very much anchor your composition if you're able to get that 8-bit going. And if you're able to get an 8-bit emblem, it's really powerful on Viego in particular, and then Lucian. If you're able to get to 8-bit Lucian, I'm pretty sure that is recipe for you to win the game. The nuance of how you play Riven is how you get there safely with a lot of HP. Because a lot of people like open forward or they lose streak and they're just bleeding too much HP. But in reality, you actually want a tempo because you're playing things like 8-bit Corki. And so you're able to kind of get momentum. And you can even like go as far as to like put some of these items into like Garen, for example, or Cassante or whoever else you're kind of pairing with. You don't have to put these items onto Corki. But a lot of times you're cutting Corki because you're playing 4 8-bits. You don't really care about which version you get from Riven, but I think 8-bit caps higher because if you can get to 6 8-bit, you win the game most likely. But also don't be afraid to play around things like Superfan and get, Deathblade on Corki and rack up that 8-bit. Some people might ask, like, if I don't have 8-bit start, like, I'm not getting that high score stacking, does that mean I can't play Riven? That's not true at all. You can actually play 8-bit Riven from almost any angle. It just helps to get that stacking high score, but it's not absolutely mandatory. You can still pivot into it. One item that really also focus on as well is Even Shroud. You really need that armor reduction. If you don't have Even Shroud, I guess you can get away with Last Whisper, but it's a lot worse. And if you do get something like Banshees, which is a support item for Riven off of like support cache or a stationary support, those are also really, really good items. That also means you don't need Quicksilver. And that also applies to things like Silver Veil and Indomitable Will. Other augments you consider are things like that help you get to Riven 3 very quickly, like Team Building. And don't forget that there's specific augments for her traits that you can take, like Live for Danger. I really think healing is good on her too. So healing orbs, harm assist, things like that are also solid. Also, another augment I think is also really underrated is long distance pals, because that just gives you so much sharing AD, then you're going to do a ton of damage. It's crazy. Leftover AD should go on Caitlyn. I think a lot of people actually over prioritize putting things on Yone and Viego. They take whatever is remaining of it, unless you're in a situation where you somehow roll for Riven 3 and Yone 3. Those are very rare. Personally, Riven 3 is just good enough, but if you're in a spot and let's just say you're playing something like, Cruel Pact or March of Progress and you just have to roll for 3-star everything, yeah, if you have Yone 3, give Yone 3 items. But Caitlyn is an 8-bit unit and she does benefit a lot from having AD items. Positioning wise, you want to make sure Riven's in the second row behind things like this Even Shroud. Even if you have her 3-star, she doesn't have a way to drop aggression. She only has a way to stop CC. And so if you put her in the top right here, for example, or you put her in the top left and you mirror, she's still going to get targeted by a lot of, burst champions. Let's say there's an Ahri and they lock onto her, she's going to die. So you don't actually want things like Riven in the front row. You want to put her in the second row. Last thing I do want to note is that people always say like, oh, do I really need Pentakill in a composition like this? Yes, you actually really want Pentakill. That's a huge buff for your entire team and it just connects really easy with the edgelords. But if you're in a situation where you have to cut something first, you want to cut things like the Pentakill before you cut things like your 4 8-bit and other things like that. This is assuming you have equal power level, like you have like a 1-star Caitlyn, a 1-star Viego, 1-star Kayle, that kind of stuff. Like if you have a 2-star Viego and a 2-star Kayle, 1-star Garen, 1-star Caitlyn, you know what to do in that situation. Yone is the last of the S tier 3 cost reroll compositions and is pretty much the same as it was before. Crowd Diver Yone is really powerful, and if you're able to hit the top end with Kiana and get 6 Crowd Diver online, you still have a very good chance of winning the game. I did a video of this earlier from 2 patches ago where we had China show off that Yone reroll is really good and ended up becoming featured in the Vegas Open, which was fun. Yone is a little bit more of an expensive reroll composition similar to Country, country where you just need to hit a lot of more expensive things. But country ends up staying on 7 and rolling for 3-star everything. And in this situation, you're trying to hit Yone 3 quickly and then move up levels to hit Kiana and Z2 and Viego. And that's going to be harder this patch because Viego is more contested because Pentakill is now a lot better. And so you end up a lot of times putting your leftover AD items on whoever. Like if you hit Z2, put leftover AD on Zed. If you hit Kiana and you have Z1 and Kiana 1 and Viego 1, maybe you put items on Kiana if it makes sense, like a blue buff or Edge of Night. Or if you hit Viego 2 and you have nothing else, just put items on Viego 2. One mistake that I see a lot of people do in Yone a lot, but also even in Riven, is that they put their tank items on someone that isn't Mordekaiser. And remember that the 3 Pentakill trait gives damage reduction, so you still want Mordekaiser to hold items because he inherently is a little bit tankier than some other Sentinels and other units. Same kind of setup though, like Mordekaiser and Riven are actually quite similar. So if you look, you see like how you have Mordekaiser with like an even shroud and you position Riven behind him. Same thing with Yone, although I guess in this case they have Zed next to it, but you can do the same type of setup exactly. I mean, it makes sense because Yone is also an edgelord, and remember edgelords like flip based off of who they're attacking, and that's just what the trait does. And so they usually end up wanting to be next to like Mordekaiser, and then once they get a target low on HP, they reverse and then try to go to the back line. The other thing I really like about Yone, besides the really high cap, is also the possibility of playing it from Heartsteel. It's a really natural connection because instead of having a Echo, for example, or Mordekaiser, you can play Cassante, and then you can just play like any kind of Heartsteel, and that allows you to get that heavy econ. Early game, one of the best item holders is Yasuo, and this also applies to Riven as well. I will say that these item suggestions are also saying Quicksilver is valid on Yone, but I do think that's a little bit outdated. You don't actually want Quicksilver. Probably going to have to make an update note on that. And actually, that's what gives Yone an edge, Lord, over Riven, is that he's way less item specific than Riven. Riven needs Quicksilver, and you know, she only has like a couple of AD items she really wants. Yone can kind of use like a lot of different things, but in general, the accepted best in slot items is Infinity Edge, Hodge, and Titan's Resolve. I've seen people go like Gargantuan Resolve, Titans, Bloodthirster. I've seen them go Hodge, BT, plus, you know, Giant Slayer. I've seen them do like a lot of different things. They've even also play Freaky Friday and get an Infinity Force on him, and that's also okay. So you don't really necessarily need a defensive item directly onto Yone. You can take some hybrid items, and this is because Yone is a scaling champion that the more he's casting his ability, the stronger he ramps up. So his defense is his ability to heal back and drain tank effectively all the damage that he's taken. Very powerful. Get him online. He's pretty insane. Country Samira is still very good because 3-cost reroll is very popular in the metagame, and also it's very stable and still has a really high cap. The high cap is thanks to the fact that you can now make a country emblem, so you always want to take Spatula. We can jump just straight to the bottom of the chalkboard. Country is now a cloak plus a spatula, and you can actually squeeze it in by just deciding to play around Katarina and playing for 7 country on level 7 and eventually getting to like a Mumu on 8. This is because the Dreadsteed actually ends up using the star level to measure its amount of power. The more star levels of your country unit specifically, the stronger your Hecarim Dreadsteed becomes. And that also applies to whoever's holding the emblem. Whoever is likely to be 3-starred and you're in that situation, put it on that unit. That means you could theoretically put it on Vex, but you do want to put the AP items onto Vex. And ultimately, the way you win the game is Samira 3, Vex 3, well, 3-star everything for the most part, 3-star all your 3 costs, and then hitting 7 country if you can. You don't need 7 country to win the game, but you are much likelier to do so. Also, one thing to note about positioning is the Hecarim always comes from the left side. So in late game situations, especially against like hyper carries like Riven Yone, you probably want to put all your composition like in the bottom left here, so that way the Dreadsteed comes in from this direction, and then you're able to have that Dreadsteed be like a tank. But at 7 country, he also becomes a carry. It's pretty nuts. A lot of times I choose to play country if I have a good AD star, because I have like armor reduction. You definitely need Last Whisper or Even Shroud. Do not skip it. If I could pick and choose, I would go Even Shroud on the front line, and then Samira would have Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, and maybe like another Infinity Edge because she just benefits and scales so well off of that crit. And then also I would make sure that I would have like a good country start in some way, like maybe have a Samira drop out of a box, Urgot drop out of an orb, and then maybe you have like multi-talented and you're just like guaranteed to hit that country. Katarina and Urgot are good item holders, but also don't forget Olaf got buffed, so you can technically have Olaf hold some of these items as well. Like he can hold Even Shroud and IE and actually just kind of pop off. Country's also really good with a ton of economy and reroll oriented augments because you do want to 3-star so many different things because it scales off that star level. So they have Infernal Contract here, but Cruel Pact and March of Progress, 2 really good prismatic augments as well. Freezer Crowd did get nerfed, but it's still really solid. And you really want a lot of combat augments, healing. You have my sword, you have my bow. Item-based augments are also really good because you want to itemize Vex, Samira, sometimes Urgot, and Frontline. So you could also justify item augments. Country's honestly been discussed like so many times that I feel like Country's also just like a pretty straightforward composition. So no need to spend more time than necessary on it. It's just very solid overall. I do want to say one thing. Do not try to play this composition if you see someone playing a Twin Terror because they're going to be taking your Vexes and Amumu's, and chances are you're just going to be playing Samira 3 and Urgot 3, which is okay. I mean, maybe you're stuck in that situation and you have to go for it, but try to avoid it if you can. So I filmed the Country stuff yesterday, and today I wanted to actually insert something else about Country that's been a development on the 2nd, 3rd day of the patch, which is that people are now starting to play around 3 Country and 4 Executioner instead and try to cut some of these useless units if you don't get a Country emblem. The board end up plays around like a level 7 board kind of like this where you're playing around Executioners instead and you're getting like a 4 Executioner 3 Country while playing around like whatever is your flex unit here. A lot of times people play like Poppy, for example, for like an Emo Mosher, but you can still go ahead and play Set. But it's still ultimately the same thing. You go for like 3-star Samira, 3-star Vex, 3-star Muth, 3-star Urgot, and you just like, you know, if you can get items on an Akali, great, but she's just there for cleanup duty, doing something like this. This is a really powerful level 7 core that's actually outperforming the standard 5 Country boards. Basically, if you can go to 7 Country, great, try to go for that, but otherwise, give this 3 Country 4 Executioner build a try, which caps out really high, and if you can get to 8, you can even tech in 5 Country again if you really want to. But I think at this spot, I'd probably go for like an Alawi or something else. That's it. Back to the video. Fast 9 or just level 9 in general is still really powerful if you can get there. And it's really hard to get there right now because the economy changes where streaks have been reduced, but Heartsteel has now been improved. So I usually recommend going for a level 9 board if one, you're like, you know, crazy streaking and you're really far ahead, you have generic 80 items slammed, you find a way to cap out really high, plus you have something like, you know, like Crab Wraith, Scuttle Puddle, rich get richer type of situations. This is something you can play for. The others, if you start off with Heartsteel and you take Raise the Stakes. Raise the Stakes is a new way you can lose streak where instead of cashing out, you can choose to raise the stakes instead. And what that means is you go into a hardcore mode where you can't win any single fight for the next 4 fights. If you do, you lose half your hearts and you cash out immediately. And that's actually bad because let's say you're at like 100 and you raise the stakes and then you win the very next fight, you lose half your hearts to 50 and then you cash out. You should have just taken the 100 instead. But if you're able to lose out, you get many more hearts instead. You can go for like some crazy like 400, 500 with, you know, 800 cash out if you get 5 heart steal. It's really powerful. In this variation, we're showing off like Illusion Ezreal variants, but there's a couple different ways you can play it. You know, we have like, you know, another example of playing around like, you know, a different type of board that has, well, this is supposed to have Caitlyn instead. It's missing a unit. And then you're able to kind of play around like a level 9 board of AD focused compositions. The priority list for best AD carries right now is Lucian as the best AD carry, Jhin, and then Ezreal, and then Caitlyn. That doesn't mean that you sell like your Ezreal headliner and then try to play like Jhin 1 or Lucian 1. I'm telling you in terms of the cap situations. In these late game boards, they're very delicate and easy to die because there's Karthus Akali and there's other different ways that people can punish your 1-star carry. And that's where units like Jhin and Lucian can kind of struggle because they can get sniped really easily. So be very, very careful when you transition your carry. I'd rather play Ezreal 2 and Caitlyn 2 holding all my items with Jhin 1, Lucian 1 than the other way around and have, you know, Ezreal 1, Jhin 1, and Lucian 1, but, you know, the legendaries are holding the items. Another thing to emphasize, you need good frontline. There's a default headline that you can play with Set, Thresh, Yorick, and Alawi, but you could also kind of impromptu make other kinds of boards. You can play Sentinels with like, you know, Echo and Blitzcrank. You can play, you know, a lot of Bruisers if you hit like, you know, Too Big to Fail, for example. So there's a lot of different variations you can play. Another unit that's really underrated is Kayn, because not only does it give you 3 Heartsteel with Ezreal, Kayn, and the Set, but also he can hold AP items because you might get random AP and you're like, what do I do with AP? HP, just throw them on Kayn. So I personally like this variation a lot. There's so many different ways that you can get there. It's almost like it would probably take another video just to explain how to fast 9 with AD. But the general just is you slam 80 items on units and try to preserve HP, or lose streak for a bunch of econ and go for big heartsteel cash out, and so on and so forth. If you want an example of how to fast 9, for example, I have a couple of them that shows off like how Setsugo and Hwanmei are able to do it. In fact, I probably should do another fast 9 into deep video this patch because it's a lot hard to get econ of, so I'll consider that. I mean, speaking of econ stuff, right, you see things like late game specialist and patient study and level up, like other augments to help you get to 9 and just get a ton of economy. One of my favorites is Spoils of War as well, so because you're able to just continue to get late game resources. But also at the same time, don't be afraid of just taking like combat augments if it makes sense. Don't just take full on greed. If you just take econ, if someone hits a comparable board state, you're just going to get beaten because they just have combat augments and you have money. And also Jazz did get buffed, so you could theoretically just like cut like even more of these units and just try to play like 3 Jazz, 4 Jazz and try to cap out with like a bunch of synergies and just have Lucian 2 with hybrid stuff. So let's go ahead and open Team Builder and show what I'm talking about. So if you're playing Bard, for example, and you're not playing like Ezreal Jhin because you're trying to play around cap Jazz board, you can take in Ziggs in this spot, give him a bunch of AP items. In this case, it's gone. And in this case, you can just tech in like another, rapid fire unit in like Caitlyn, and then, play like a 4 Jazz setup like this. I will say that now that Jazz cannot be crafted, it's a lot rarer, but it is worth pursuing if you're able to get it because they did buff it. So I'm not saying that you should make Jazz only because you can't, because that's now a country emblem. Another setup that you can play with AD that's also underrated is around Qiyana. If you do end up playing around Qiyana, a lot of times you want to make sure to tie in a backline unit and not Echo. So a lot of times you end up going for Senna so that way you can tie in the rapid fire and that true damage. And now you can have Qiyana Lucian as your carries and then just kind of flexing with Jazz around that. The problem with playing like Echo and Qiyana and everything like that is you kind of run out of space for your melee units to walk through unless you want to move back your tentacles. But that could be something you do, especially if you have a lot of Karthus Akali. If you do end up playing around Karthus Akali, you want to do something like this where you keep your carry in the center and Akali just keeps bouncing back and forth. And then you have these units kind of tanking and Karthus end up targeting the tentacles as well. So those are all the comps that I believe to be top tier in the meta currently. I think that there's a lot of potential for some other comps to maybe move into S tier, but those are the clear winners from the very beginning of the patch of 14.1. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And I'll see you guys in the next video where we can talk about other comps that I think are also really strong in that A-B tier, but they are more conditional. It's not that they can't compete with the S, it's just that you need to have the right conditions. And I'll tell you all about it next time. Also, as a reminder, I have a second channel dedicated to highlights and other fun games that are less serious than what I'm talking about here, showing the fun side of TFT where either I'm doing some meme builds or some wacky, crazy high rolls. So go check that out and sub if you can in the link below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.